All you, Matt.
All right. You want me to go for this? So last time, if I remember right, Tammy and we were talking about the 6 principles of sexual health put out by the Harvey Institute. And I think we got through the first three. And so I was going to jump on probably the back three, or at least if we got on one, we could stay on one, and that's fine. So I'll do a quick review. Principle number one is consent, and sexual health requires sex to be consensual. Um, Principle number two is that it's non-exploitative, and so that exploitation is not occurring within the sexual relationship. Principle number three was honesty, and so that there is basically honest and direct communication with basically yourself and sexual partners. Um, and so we went through, I believe, if I remember right, all three of those. Uh, Principle number four. So I'll dive into that a little bit deeper right now. Principle number four, and this is from the Harvey Institute, 6 principles of sexual health. Number four is shared values. And it's so funny because I'm half tempted just to read this, but he basically says the day after a dolphin has sex, they don't spend the next day talking with their fellow dolphins about whether it was too soon. But humans do. With children, teens, and adults of all ages, they think about their values and how they relate to experimenting with sexual activity, entering sexual relationships, facing gender and sexual relationship diversity. And he basically goes on to that talks about how important in a healthy sexual relationship that we have shared values, that we talk about what those values are. Um, and so one of the biggest sexual value conflicts that's discussed is um, the sexual debut, or in our culture, what we and I don't love this phrase. It's the losing one's virginity, right? The sexual debut is when you lose your virginity. But basically that there's no cultural agreement around the circumstances in which a person should first experience sexual intercourse. And throughout our lifespan, sexual values play an important role as to why each of us engage in sex. Um, and the other thing is that there's specific sexual acts or turn-ons that can have a very different meaning for one person than for the other person, the other partner. And sexual values are a huge source of identifying our sexual standards and ethics. And so value differences, even like when honestly and vulnerably shared between partners, can lead to a lot of amazing closeness, but it can also lead to painful distance. But either way, like in order to have a healthy sexual relationship, we have to have and talk about shared values. And so when I say we have to have shared values, I think at a minimum, we have to have conversations around them. I think sometimes pain, trauma in relationships come up because we maybe think that we have shared values, but we don't discuss that well enough beforehand, or and it's not even beforehand. I think it's really important for us to discuss them with each other now. Like as partners, sure, we may have some negative history that's gone on between us, but we need to have conversations about what are the values that I hold and that you hold. Where do we see differences? And I think too often there's the dynamic when you're in a betrayal situation of, well, I'm no longer allowed to even have values or have beliefs or sexual standards because of what I've done wrong. Um, I'm not even allowed to have it. So sometimes it's like well, because I've made mistakes and maybe sexually broken our values, I'm now not even allowed to want or have sex in the relationship. And this creates uh, potentially an exploitative situation, whereas it was the exploitative situation in the first place that created the betrayal. But it's just kind of flipping that table around, if that makes sense. So we can pause here, Scott. You and I can discuss this, and we could spend the rest of the webinar talking about it. But it's up to what questions everybody has or what you
Okay.
got, Scott.
Um, yeah. First of all the topics that I've covered on various webinars with various hosts, dolphin sex has never come up until today. So I want to thank you for spinning me in a new direction. Yeah. Uh, yeah. Um,
Afterwards, ask me more about that because I
yeah.
have something even more fascinating that'll blow your mind.
All
So
right.
I'm not
As
gonna
long as it's not
publicly
like a
talk.
video, I don't need any videos of dolphins. you know. Um,
You have
um,
no idea.
Yes, no, heaven forbid I do. That's the scary part. I teach our porn addiction work group. Trust me, I've heard it all. Um, you said we need to talk about, ask about and talk about our shared values. Um, what values in particular are these values specifically related to sex? Values in general? Can you give some
Well,
examples?
so this is talking specifically about as far as sexual health goes, we need to talk about the various sexual values we have. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, there was a time where when I was probably a young trained CSAT, that like the value, one of the things that I felt like I had learned was like, oh, well, masturbation is wrong and it should never happen. Like it may sound funny that I'm saying that, but I swear there was messaging that I received being a CSAT that it's like, hey, once somebody's a sexual addict, then masturbation's never something that they're allowed to experience from this point forward. And so, like, as simple as it sounds, it's this realization that, like, hey, so in our relationship, what are your thoughts and feelings about masturbation? Like, when is it okay? When is it not okay? And it's not that we're asking the other person for permission. It's we're having a conversation about what our belief system is around this thing, right? Like, I've had couples that are like, oh, well, I guess, we used to occasionally watch porn together. And like, again, I'm not trying to tell you guys what's okay and what's not okay in your relationships. I'm just trying to use some examples. But like now that my partner's an addict, we are never going to do that again. And it's like, well, if what are your values around it? Is it this realization that, hey, this wasn't good for us and it's created problems, and so we need to remove it? Well, can we have that conversation rather than these are the universal truths of maybe sex addiction recovery, and masturbation's never okay? And it's like, well, is it not? Like, let's talk about it as a couple and let's figure out what our belief system is. Because I've had couples that have been in recovery 10 years, and I will start to bring up like, hey, where are you guys in your sexual relationship? What are your belief systems around certain things? And I find out that as good as they're doing in recovery, they don't even have a conversation about um masturbation and when it's okay, we're not okay, and or about their beliefs around how frequently they'd like to have sex, or when having sex is okay and when it's not okay. Like, if that makes any sense, like, it's the shared values are like, what are all of your value systems um around the sexual experience between the two of you or within the relationship. And
Gotcha.
even like, hey, let's have a conversation about how you learned your sexual values. I may not agree with them, but like, tell me the story of how that developed for you. So some people, their sexual value might be, I will not have sex prior to marriage. And another person's like, oh, I didn't have that value at all. Like, so it's like, okay, so where did you learn these? Do you think that that value was good? Do you think it had some negative to it? Sorry,
Yeah,
was
and
this enough to explain
no,
that?
yeah, that's very helpful. And things like, what counts as infidelity, what doesn't, can I chat with my ex online or not? Can
Well,
I look at
right. And
porn or not?
it's fascinating because what I've found, I'll get people that'll come in and they have the sexual betrayal, for instance, and it used to be in my brain, I might think, oh, well, they were looking at porn and masturbating. And it's funny because the partner will be like, yeah, I mean, I don't love that, but that's not the issue. And I'm like, okay, so then what's the issue? And they're like, I didn't like that I would ask, like, hey, are you doing this? And they would lie to me. Right. And so what you find out is that there's certain values that we assume, well, this was a violation of the marital agreement or the relational agreement. And it's like, actually, it's not what you think it is. Right. So if we start to have a conversation about what are the violation of the values, or what are the values to begin with?
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. 9 times out of 10, it's not that you went to a strip club with the guys, it's that you didn't tell me about it. And
Right. It's
you
we
kept it
didn't have a
secret.
we
Why
don't
are you keeping it secret? You know?
right. And they might, and your partner might say, I don't love the idea of you going to a strip club with the guys, but
Right.
if you go, like, tell me, right? And so it's this strange place where, again, we may not even share the same values, but if we go back to the principle number 3 of honesty, we might be able to work within each other's value system to figure out what works and doesn't work for us. So
Yeah.
most of the time, the betrayal is a lack of is an honesty issue, not even this mismatch of values.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, one of the huge issues that you see in your practice, we see, in our treatment center, and that I hear about just talking to people, is there's no communication about sex. They have no idea what their partner's values are. They don't even Most people don't even know what their own values are around sex.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's why when I was quasi reading this, it was, the that one's own values and like others. So like we have to come to terms with our own values. Have we even thought about it? If we've thought about it, have we talked about it? Right? I've found one of the most uh I don't know, surprising things is how little even healthy couples, how little they talk about sexual health or their sexual relationship. I've had couples like, we can do it, but we don't talk about it
Right.
ever. And it's like, man, like you have sex on a regular basis, you have a healthy relationship, but at the same time, you never have a conversation, and that conversation is off limits. It's
Yeah.
too uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's a weird one. So cool.
Weird,
Let's
except
let's
it's actually
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, in the house I grew up in, I don't know what yours was like, but I mean, sex was this thing we knew it existed, but it's dirty and nobody actually does it, and we're certainly not going to talk about it. I mean, that was my sexual education, and it was like, you know, how did my sister and I get here? Obviously, you did it at least twice. It's yeah, but
Right.
I mean, my sister and I joke. We think our parents had sex exactly twice, once for each of us, because that's how taboo it was. I mean, I don't think either of us ever actually believes that, but you know,
It's almost like that's the feeling because
right.
of how just
Yeah.
bad it is.
Yeah. And, we will certainly never discuss this. So, yeah. Um, let's do the other two and then we'll go to questions. We got a small group and there's only one question here. So let's go through the other two, but one at a
Okay.
time.
So the next one is at number 5. It's protection or being protected from STIs, HIV, and unwanted pregnancy. And so the idea is that sexual health principle number 5 is anyone that's engaged in sexual activity, that they need to that there needs to be implemented a contraceptive plan, um, preventing acquiring a sexually transmitted infection and take precautions to prevent transmission of HIV. It's access to tests that identify the presence of a sexually transmitted infection. It's basically the scientific and medically accurate information, right? Like basically that everybody deserves to have an education, to be protected, and to basically choose pregnancy. And that this in and of itself is one of the major sexual health principles. And that, like, for instance, a lack of medically accurate information about these sexual health prevention is or protection is a major issue. That less than 20 states require sex education be provided, that it be medically accurate. And so essentially you have more than the majority of the states that it's not required that it's medically accurate. I mean, and then we can get into the conversation. I mean, we don't need to, maybe we shouldn't, but should schools even be providing that, right? And why I say that is, you know, if we were all able to have healthy homes, this should be a conversation that we are having as parents with children, and that this in and of itself is a major sexual health principle. Like, should as families, we need to be talking about this, as schools, as churches, right, as communities, that this is a major important sexual health principle.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but you know, my sex education, fifth grade, um, boys have penises, girls have vaginas. Okay, we're done. You know, I mean, that was pretty much what I took away from sex ed.
Man, I learned that from Kindergarten Cop,
Right, right.
the Arnold
Yeah,
Schwarzenegger movie.
yeah. It's that little kid with boys have penises, girls have. It's like, thank you.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, but that was basically what they taught us,
right.
and I think every parent in town thought their kid knew what they needed to know about sex. And in point of fact, we knew nothing about sex. Um, you know, we could identify body parts, and there was, you know, no, you know, certainly didn't talk about unwanted pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases and all that. You know, I mean, they may have told us you can't get pregnant from a toilet seat, but um, you know, there's this again. It goes back to what we talked about with shared values, and I'm sure that you were talking about 2 weeks ago is lack of communication. Um, but yeah, and particularly lack of communication before the act of sex. Um, you know,
Yeah, no, and that's I see it, that the and I guess this is the frustration that comes up for me as I see this. So many betrayals that occur in our relationships are quite simply a lack of communication before things happen. And sometimes it's intentional deceit.
yes.
Um, for instance, I've had people that will say, "Well, I asked my spouse if they looked at porn, and they said no, that they used to, but they don't anymore." And there's a lot of that that's actually true. That they're like, "Hey, while we're dating and getting married, you know, I wasn't, and I thought that once we get married, that it wouldn't be a problem anymore, and then it came back." You know, and it's like, but it's so much of it isn't the behavior itself as it is just the lack of communication, the lack of honesty.
Yeah, and there's also lots of assumptions. Well, you know, one time my wife and I, when we were dating, we looked at porn, and so I just assumed it was okay.
Right.
And you know, and now I'm doing it 6 hours a day, and she's mad, and I don't understand why. Um, you know, it's yeah, it's that lack of communication. So, okay, I don't have any more on that one.
All right. So this number six, and it's pleasure. So this is an interesting sexual health principle. I actually love this one. too often when I'm helping couples work through sexual issues, whatever they might be, I actually encourage my couples, like, stop focusing on orgasm being the goal. Um, the goal needs to be focused on pleasure. And it's interesting because if I were to stereotype here, the men probably struggle to understand this more than the women. Um, where it's like, where I've had women who are like, maybe for instance, they're like, I don't need to orgasm every time. It's really enjoyable. It's really pleasurable for me. In fact, sometimes if I don't have to have maybe the pressure of needing to orgasm, then I feel way better in the experience. And I might ultimately be more likely to if I don't have that pressure, right? And so what's interesting is that when we get into understanding the importance of pleasure in a sexual relationship, we actually start to really understand each other very differently than maybe we would have before. And one of the examples that he gives in listing out the sexual health principle number 6 is he says that the giving and receiving between sexual partners, um, that the sexual pleasure is often the source of conflict when our pleasure conflicts with other aspects of our overall private and public identity, right? And so a lot of times we don't talk about what brings us pleasure because we're ashamed or embarrassed or we're afraid that our spouse is going to judge us. And so he gives an example to try and help understand. And I want everyone, when I read this example, to understand that whether somebody chooses to act on this or not, it's understanding that sexual pleasure can come in all sorts of different ways. And so the example that he uses here is a married, cisgendered, heterosexual identified woman may find peak sexual pleasure dominating a submissive trans man that she has no emotional connection with other than the immediate moment of power exchange and erotic exploration. Too often, judgments about the lack of congruence between what we are expected to find pleasurable competes with the erotic demands of our most hungry sexual desires. And I love that he's like trying to nuance and explain that pleasure is so unique for each one of us, and that oftentimes that pleasure or the lack of pleasure in our sexual relationship is what leads us often into places where we aren't open. We're too afraid of the judgment. And he goes back to saying engaging in conversation, education, or accurate information with teens, for instance, about sexual pleasure is typically avoided. And so we need, throughout all the stages of our life, we have to figure out how to balance one's sexual safety and responsibility with lifelong curiosity of pleasure. We have to explore our sexual interests and remain curious about the ever-changing sources of our sexual pleasure. And I realize that this could be very triggering for people to hear, but so often this is one nuance of why people go to unhealthy sexual behavior, because they don't feel like they have a place to even discuss, let alone explore sexual pleasure with their partner. Now, this does not give anyone an excuse or an out, or to be able to blame their partner for breaking relational agreements. This is no room for an excuse or blame here, but I think it's important that we have conversations around this. Where did you feel you weren't getting your sexual pleasure needs met? And how did you use that to justify the unhealthy direction you went? in the relationship. But this is a very mature conversation
Right.
for a couple to have. Then beyond that, how can we work together to meet each other's sexual pleasure needs? If that makes sense.
Yes. And I definitely have thoughts or questions here. Um, so you use the example of, the hetero cisgender woman who likes to dominate somebody that she has no real connection with. And that's all
Right.
great and perfectly healthy and normal. I mean, the swath of normal sex is enormous. Um, but if that is my wife and we are in a monogamous relationship and I'm not cool with that, then we have a problem. And what you just said is she can't blame me for not wanting to sit there and get spanked because it's not my thing as a reason for her to cheat and vice versa.
Correct. Right. Like what we have to do is figure out how best to show up for each other within our values
Right.
to try and help each other have the experiences that we want to have. And
Yep.
there is that idea that, okay, well, let's say we do not get to a place of agreement on how to get this met. Well, then do I stay within the value system of the relationship within our relational agreements, or do I tell my partner either I'm going to break those agreements, or do I terminate the relationship to seek out my pleasure? Right? Is it worth it to that person? Right? That's where that person has to figure out within my value system, is me seeking sexual pleasure more important than the value of keeping the relationship I've committed to together? And
Yeah.
I'm sitting here going, look, I know where I'm at, right? Like, and I could tell you the judgments that I've created and how I've chosen to live my life, but it doesn't matter. Like each person has to figure out what they believe and how they're going to act. Um, and so if somebody, so a term that I've used, somebody might have to grieve the loss of their desire.
Right.
Like within my current relationship, I can't act out on this pleasure without causing pain. And so I might have to grieve that loss. The relationship might be worth it to me to grieve that loss until either something changes in the relationship or the relationship itself changes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Sometimes we have to decide because we can't have both things.
yeah. And
Which is more important to me?
a phrase that I've used before that applies, I think, way more broadly is every choice has a loss. When I chose to go back to school and get my master's degree and become a psychotherapist, I lost time, money that I could have put into becoming a lawyer. Because I mean, heaven knows the world could use more lawyers. And
Sure. He says
I'm
to a
sorry.
guy with an unused law degree.
Oh, that's right. Um, but it's that idea of when I made that choice, I had to accept that there's more loss that I experienced than things that I gained. But when we make decisions in life, when we make choices, we gain something and we lose all the things that we basically chose to let go of. And so if we take that down to this, well, is the pleasure of being in the relationship I'm in worth missing out on the pleasure sexually, if you will, that I can't get met? So, but let's at least have a conversation around that.
Yeah, and to that end, let's go back to kind of the first thing you said here. And you didn't say stop focusing on performance. I think you said stop focusing on orgasm, but I always guys, men in particular, seem to be like, well, if this doesn't end in fireworks with an orgasm, then it wasn't good. And it's like, guys, I I'll talk to guys in their 80s who have like colon cancer or something, and they're upset because they can't. And I'm like, is that the be all end all of being physically intimate with your partner? And they just can't wrap their head around the fact that maybe it doesn't have to, sex doesn't have to be about sex. Maybe sex can be about enjoying physical pleasure with each other, instead of putting all this emphasis on having a rock hard erection and having a you know blast of an orgasm. It's just, and sex addicts in particular seem to think that the only pleasurable thing about sex is an orgasm, and they can be really disconnected. They can be in fantasy land with their addiction while they're with their partner. And it's because they feel like there's this one and only goal for sex. And you're saying, and I agree with you, isn't there a lot more to this? So I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting because um, I got mildly distracted. So when you talked about why men might focus on the orgasm, and
Well, I
I
mean,
start
sex addicts tend to focus on the orgasm, in my
well,
opinion.
sure. So you could look at it if you look at it just from a, if you will, pleasure and pain standpoint. There is the phenomenon. Oh gosh, I always pronounce it wrong, but it's epididymal hypertension, and that's basically blue balls, where there's a buildup of fluid in the testicles when a male is aroused. And if I so I was trying to see real quick if I could figure it out, because I read somewhere at one time that it was like 70% of all men experience that, and it's painful. It's like a migraine headache in the testicles. And but I mean, there are women who actually feel a similar can feel a similar pain. And so sometimes, and the remedy, if you will, is orgasm. Typically, that's a remedy. But and so there is like sometimes there's pressure, like literal pressure, that this needs to end in orgasm, otherwise I'm going to get blue balls. And so I guess there's that part that I started to like jump into that direction for a second and be there is an understanding of why that may be the case, but sometimes it's because I think unfortunately we focus too much that the greatest pleasure is actually in the orgasm. And when I tell people, like, I want you to sit with that. Have you ever had an orgasm that was like just kind of meh, right? And it's like, and so to really say that, when you really start breaking down, most people, they're able to say, you know what, it really isn't about the orgasm. Like, so often it's the buildup, it's the foreplay, it's the passion. Well, all of that is what we refer to as like pleasure, right? And so you look at it and it's like this giving and receiving of pleasure. The unfortunate thing is that we become so singularly minded that the orgasm is the pleasure. And it's like, no, that's just like the
Yeah,
climactic moment, right?
yeah,
But like the reality of it is that, like, so we put the pleasure in that sphere. It's the climax.
right.
um but the reality of it is that I'm like, hey, if all you had was the climax and you didn't have anything else, like, is it as pleasurable? And people are like, well, no. Like, or I've had times where I have the climax, but it really wasn't that pleasurable. And it's like, yeah, that's because the
Right,
pleasure is so much more.
right.
But too often we don't even understand our bodies and understand the experience well enough to realize how much pleasure there is and what it even looks like.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
Oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
Uh, you know, I find that the most enjoyable sex, and this is just my personal experience, but other people seem to agree, is sex that is an expression of emotion, a physical expression of the emotional intimacy that already exists. If I feel connected with you, if I feel love for you, if I and there's an attraction, and and I feel safe with you, and I'm not, if you get mad at me, I'm not worried you're going to leave, and vice versa. And then sex can be really spontaneous, and we're focused on each other because I'm not thinking about the neighbor or porn or the strip club and we're laughing and we're talking and we're joking. And you know what? If I have erectile dysfunction today, we can, I can give you a back rub or, you know, do something else, and it's just not a big deal.
Right. We
Um,
can still have connection.
right. And we can still give each other physical pleasure. And I think what you were talking about is all that physical pleasure and the emotional pleasure that comes with it before the orgasm. I mean, is that kind of what you're discussing
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because, when we're like in the example that he used about the, cisgendered woman dominating a trans male, that sort of thing, you could look at that and go, like, there might be a peak of pleasure in there that is absolutely amazing for that individual. And what we are trying to figure out as a couple is what are all the ways that we can experience pleasure. And sometimes it might be an intensity pleasure, sometimes it might be an emotional connection pleasure. But yes, I've heard a lot of people tell me, man, the most incredible sex I've ever had is when I feel truly emotionally connected and all of that. And that's great. So let's have those conversations. But another person might be like, oh, that's nice, but man, I love the intensity
there?
of
Yeah. And
this type of experience.
I'm not saying that, you can't have, you got 30 seconds, I got 30 seconds, and then I got to go to work. So,
Oh, totally.
wham,
No,
that can be awesome and super connected sex at the same time, you
right.
know, and, or BDSM or whatever, you can have the intensity, which is the dopamine adrenaline rush. But
Uh-huh.
when you have the emotional connection, you also get serotonin and oxytocin and norepinephrine, which are other neurochemicals that help us feel safe and connected and seen and loved and bonded.
Right. And
And
I love that you mentioned like the quickie, if you will, because
quickies
the
are hot.
interesting thing is,
I mean,
yeah, and it's interesting because I found that in recovery, um, sometimes a betrayed partner might like say, okay, from here on out, I only want really connected, emotionally, candles and rose petals or whatever. Like it needs to, and very long and drawn out, because what they're doing is saying anything that doesn't feel like really connected makes me wonder
yeah,
if this is like acting out for you. And I'm always like, all right, well, slow down, like, because the truth is, the way that I often see it is that when a partner reaches to another partner, that's a very vulnerable thing. Even if it's for a quickie, there is still a vulnerable connection. Whereas in a betrayal type of behavior, it's oftentimes about, disconnected, dissociative, if that makes sense.
right,
And so I always am trying to push my partners to be like, hey, I want you to consider that it may be a really healthy, positive thing for you guys to have a quickie. It may be a really healthy and positive thing for you guys to have something that maybe doesn't feel as deeply connected or whatever, but because it still can be connective.
right.
And that's something that the two of you have to explore together. Like, how do you bring that back into the relationship without feeling like it needs to look a certain way every time?
Right. Yeah, I describe them as anniversary sex and birthday sex. Anniversary sex is, rose petals and candles and, looking into the eyes and let me count the ways I love you. And birthday sex is like, yeah, let's go get some pizza, you know?
That's funny. I'm
And
going
they're
to use
both
that.
great because it's, if the connection is there, if I trust that the emotional connection is there, sex can be anything, with or without an orgasm.
Absolutely.
Should we jump into questions? We have a question.
We got one question.
All
So
right. If you
all
have
you other
questions, put them in. What can the child do about parent-child relationship with their spouse? What can the parent do? No more boundaries. I think this is an enmeshment question.
yeah.
Sounds like we have an enmeshed partner.
Yeah. So it's tough because I don't have any context here, but I think it's a great question. So the individual in the relationship who tends to be in the child role, I believe that was the first question. What can the child do? Um, so the individual in the child role, I think, has to become more aware of when they recognize that they're in a power down position, and so that they start to recognize, hey, you know what? I'm in that child role. I'm asking you permission. A lot of times is what it feels like, instead of coming to you and saying, hey, I have an idea. This is something I'd like to do. I was wondering what your thoughts are. I'm not asking you permission per se, but because you're my equal partner, I want to know what you think and feel or whatever. I want to take that into consideration. And then I'm going to talk to you about the decision I want to make. Right? Like, for instance, if we were to make this about finances, I have a thought, and I'll just give you an example. Um, I had one of my I've talked about it before on here. You guys know that I enjoy cycling, and because I enjoy cycling, I love to buy bikes. And one of my bikes broke down badly last year, and I had a choice to make. I either buy a whole nother bike or I spend just about the same amount to fix this one up. And I stewed on it because I loved the bike, and so I kept trying to figure out what the best choice was to make. And I ended up going to my wife and saying, hey, I've decided I'm going to make this choice, and it's going to cost about this much, and I just want to make sure that you and I are on the same page, because financially it was, it's a bit of cash. And it was weird because in times past I would have asked her permission, right? But I didn't. I've learned not to swing to the other side where it's like, you know what? I don't need to ask her permission. She's not my parent. And so I go purchase it. And then she's like, what did you do? Like, this is a lot of money. And did you know that we, had this thing coming up for one of the kids and whatever else? Like, so you don't swing to the other direction where you don't have a conversation and you just go do it without talking. But it's this, hey, I've made a decision. This is what I think I want to do. I'm curious. Is there anything I'm not thinking about? And we go, and then ultimately, once we talked about it, she was like, basically, thanks for letting me know. Go ahead and, I think, do what you feel you think is best here. And essentially, I'm on board. And my wife recently made that decision about something else this happened actually just like a week ago, that she was like, hey, this is what I want to do. How do you feel about it? And I spent some time just thinking about it and then letting her know, here's my thoughts and opinions. And ultimately she made a decision, and her biggest fear was, are you going to resent me? And I was like, no. Like, why? Because we did this conversation. And so essentially, when the child feels like they're in the child role, they need to um, to become aware that they're in that role. That helps so much. And they can even say to their partner, I feel like I'm in the child role. Even if the partner's like, well, that's good to know, because without knowing, I might have responded in a way that felt like the parent role. And so as the partner who knows that they get put in the parent role, or who might want to take on the parent role because they're scared, right? They might be more controlling because they're scared. it's recognizing, oh, I don't want this dynamic either. So how do I back off from the parent role and you step up from the child role, and we then work together, and the comment goes on, in a collaborative and supportive, respectful way with each other, where we both have an equal worth, we both have an equal role. And so we're mindful of that pattern, and we're mindful. I don't want to be in the parent role. That's gross. I don't want to be in the child role. That's gross. Like, I want to be an equal. Now, there are some people that they're like, hey, my wife, she controls all the finances. I have no problem going to her and saying, hey, I want to buy this thing. Do I have your permission? And if it works for the two of you and there's no resentment or animosity or whatever, then cool, do what works. But
Yeah.
hopefully
There's
that gives you some perspective.
there's a bit here that the person in the parent role, what can they do? No more boundaries. And yeah, just take that, because no
Yeah.
boundaries is terrible.
Yeah, I've said this before. Me personally, I believe that the healthiest relationships, the most intimate relationships, have the most boundaries. But you have to understand what boundaries are. If you've heard me talk about this before, boundaries are not controlling somebody else. Boundaries are not punishing somebody else. Boundaries are about knowing what your needs and desires are. And so the relationship that is the deepest and strongest that I've ever had, I have the most understanding about what my partner's needs and wants and boundaries are. And I want to know more of them, because the more I know, the better I'm able to show up for my partner. And so give me as many boundaries as you can, so that I have a clear understanding of like what works and what doesn't work for you. So no more boundaries means chaos. More boundaries means I have a greater ability to respect you and to show up for you. So I want as many boundaries as you got. Give them all.
Yeah, and boundaries are not about, if I set a boundary with Matt, it's not about me controlling Matt's behavior. It's about me knowing how I'm going to respond when Matt behaves in a certain way. It's not about Matt's behavior at all. It's about mine. And I can tell Matt, look, last time when you went out and spent $4,000 on a bike, I kind of freaked out. It wasn't the $4,000. It was that you spent a huge chunk of money and didn't tell me you were going to do it. I don't need to sign off, but I would like to know about it in advance. And if you do that, I'll almost assuredly say, yeah, if it's important to you, fine. But if you don't come to me, I might get really mad, because it's like, what just happened to our finances? Am I not part of this relationship too? So the boundary is not telling Matt, you can't spend any money without me okaying it. It's, for me to feel as an equal in this relationship, I just like to know what you're thinking about. It was about, I want you to, in my world, but, safely. I don't want you surprising me with $4,000 expenditures. Or, whatever, you're a real biker, so you probably have expensive bikes. So,
I do. I have spent more and less on bikes. So
yeah. Yeah, there we go. I just bought one not that long ago. So I was like, okay, these are pricey. It's not
oh
my
yeah.
Schwinn that was $39.99 at Sears when I
Dude,
was a kid.
I can't do that. That doesn't work for me personally.
Yeah. So,
But
uh,
I mean, I sometimes I put more miles on a bike than I do on a car. So
yeah, yeah, I probably do lately, actually. Um, um, you said to ask you about the Dolphins. We've got a few minutes left. You said you had something else. Is that not appropriate for the webinar?
not for the webinar.
Okay, then we'll skip that one.
I said later, as in you and I offline.
All right. Gotcha.
I mean, it's just I mean, really, when you look at it, everybody's got their thing.
True. So, all right. We're almost out of time. We're out of questions. So,
Oh, we got another one.
We got one. Yay. I have mild ED, erectile dysfunctions, and sometimes when my partner and I start to have sex, I start feeling nervous because I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get an erection. And usually when that happens, I just can't snap out of it. Any advice? Is there something I can do?
Um, that is actually a wonderful and very normal experience for a lot of men. So I love that you're asking it. Um, First of all, I would have some conversations with your partner, like around, hey, um, this is what my nervousness is about. I'm nervous. I'm going to disappoint you. I'm nervous that you, and here's one that's actually kind of common. I'm nervous that you're going to think I've acted out recently, which really isn't often true, but like, right. So what you want to start to do is explore with your partner, what is all your nervousness? And ask your partner, like, can I have a space, like, and it's going to sound maybe a little silly, but can I have a judgment free zone that, like, if ED happens, can you just promise to love me and accept me as I am? And as I learn to work through and get past this nervousness, um, there is the biggest killer of sexual performance for men, and I mean, in all honesty, women too, but is probably fear. And nervousness is just a low grade version of fear, if you will. Because you even said it, when I start feeling nervous because I'm afraid, um, when you start spinning with those thoughts, it's going to kill that erection faster, even faster. And so what
And
we
oh,
learn
by the
to
way, like
do,
Viagra is not even going to help in this situation because the problem is not down here, it's in here. And Viagra works down there, not here.
yeah,
So
so it's learning how to actually go, oh, I lost an erection. And like the other thing is that too many people have this belief that if a man is turned on, he'll get an erection and he'll keep an erection and it won't go away until he's done performing. And it's like that's not actually how it works. Like we actually need to accept as a culture that the penis can become erect and become more flaccid and erect and more flaccid throughout the sexual experience. Like we start to learn, like, actually this, there's nothing abnormal and it's totally okay. um and so it's all that fear and nervousness around it that is actually likely why you're not able to get it back going. So learning to accept, hey, whether I get it back going or not, it's okay, we're experiencing pleasure together, right? This is where it's super helpful to experience pleasure and go, hey, whether I get it back or not, I'm going to focus on you experiencing pleasure. I'm going to focus on me experiencing pleasure. And if the erection happens, it does. If it doesn't, that's fine too. We can still have a very pleasurable experience, right? This is another reason why pleasure is the goal, not orgasm.
yeah,
Because
yes.
I
You know,
know that, and
go ahead.
I'd have to look it up, but I recently was taking in one of my classes. It said, and again, I'm probably gonna get this wrong, but it was some statistic like when there is um sexual, oh gosh, how am I gonna say this? So essentially when there is a lack of sex, especially in like older couples, it is almost always the man who is basically not wanting it. And a lot of times it's because of this fear around performance and his masculinity being around his erection and how long he can keep it or whatever else, or sadly, penis size or whatever it might be. But that's not older men, that's a lot of men at any age. But and so it's usually, it's, you're right, I can't snap out of it. My focus for you would to focus on how do I experience pleasure whether I have a full erection or not, and regardless of what my penis chooses to do, because oftentimes it seems to have a mind of its own. And so I'm gonna enjoy and learn to have sex without the focus being on what my penis chooses to do or not do.
Yeah. And I think this is a very common issue for male recovering sex and porn addicts, particularly the first 6 months to a year or sometimes more of recovery is, you know, the brain is still trying to normalize from the addiction, we're used to the super stimulus of the addiction, which is generally more than, what we get from a single real world partner, no matter how beautiful and how much we love her or him. um, it takes the brain a while to get back to normal. So ED and other forms of sexual dysfunction are very common in recovering males.
Totally.
Yeah. So you're not off base. Just want to make sure you understand, like, this
Oh
is
yeah.
kind of part of the process.
I'm actually super proud of you for being vulnerable enough to ask that question. Like that actually is so cool. We don't talk about it enough as men. There is way too much self-worth
Mhm.
tied up in our sexual performance. And if we actually talked about it, we would realize that this is actually normal.
Yeah, for all ages and all
Yep.
situations. So we are out of time now. So Matt, it is lovely to see you again. I miss doing these, but
A pleasant surprise. It was
good to
great
see
seeing
you.
you, Scott.
All right. Thank you everybody for being here. Matt will be back in a couple of weeks, and Tammy will probably be feeling better by then. I certainly hope so.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
we'll see you then. Thanks.
See you guys.